Fox and birds, a battle of wit and wings. The fox watched the birds circle above. And the fox knew the birds were not just food but voices of the sky. And the bee hummed nearby. The fox crouched low in the grass. And the birds noticed the fox but kept their wings steady. And the bee darted nervously. The fox understood the silence of the birds. And the fox's amber eyes followed the birds. And the bee flickered like a golden spark. The fox crept closer to the birds. And the birds spread wide wings to warn the fox. And the bee buzzed in warning. The fox felt hunger burn. And the birds sensed the fox's intention. And the bee hovered between both worlds. The fox pounced in thought. But the birds rose higher away from the fox. But the bee clung to a flower. The fox snarled softly. And the birds cried sharp notes at the fox. And the bee trembled in the air. The fox pretended to retreat. But the birds did not trust the fox. But the bee lingered above. The fox sat in patience. But the birds knew patience of the fox meant danger. But the bee darted again. The fox watched shadows of the birds cross the ground. And the fox tracked every bird. And the bee kept circling. The fox's tail twitched. And the birds shifted wings above the fox. And the bee hummed an uneasy tune. The fox studied the rhythm of the birds. And the birds studied the fox. And the bee wove a line between them. The fox whispered to the wind. But the birds whispered to the clouds above the fox. But the bee whispered in buzzing. The fox thought of strategy. And the birds thought of safety from the fox. And the bee thought of survival. The fox crouched again. And the birds screeched at the fox. And the bee hovered closer to witness. The fox lunged forward. And the birds soared higher above the fox. And the bee escaped sideways. The fox's leap fell short. And the birds laughed in cries at the fox. And the bee shook in air. The fox hissed frustration. And the birds circled mocking the fox. And the bee drifted calm again. The fox looked to the horizon. And the birds followed the fox's eyes. And the bee traced the sky. The fox knew the birds were clever. And the birds knew the fox was clever. And the bee knew both. The fox rose in pride. And the birds descended to test the fox. And the bee kept watch. The fox barked aloud. And the birds cried louder than the fox. And the bee whispered low. The fox moved to water. And the birds followed the fox. And the bee danced on ripples. The fox stared into reflection. And the birds reflected the fox in wings. And the bee shimmered. The fox tried another plan. And the birds guessed the fox's plan. And the bee buzzed truth. The fox circled the field. And the birds circled the fox. And the bee circled both. The fox rested a moment. And the birds hovered above the fox. And the bee hovered too. The fox sighed heavily. And the birds sighed in wings above the fox. And the bee sighed in hums. The fox's hunger deepened. And the bird's caution deepened for the fox. And the bee deepened silence. The fox watched the smallest birds. And the birds watched the sharpest fox. And the bee kept balance. The fox stepped closer again. And the birds flapped harder at the fox. And the bee trembled midair. The fox felt tricked. And the birds felt tested by the fox. And the bee felt tension. The fox turned swiftly. And the birds turned quicker than the fox. And the bee turned too. The fox roared louder. And the birds sang stronger than the fox. And the bee hummed steady. The fox lunged twice. And the birds flew twice higher than the fox. And the bee darted twice. The fox thought deeply. And the birds thought deeper than the fox. And the bee thought timeless. The fox watched sunset. And the birds glowed in sunset above the fox. And the bee glowed faintly. The fox felt lonely. And the birds felt wary of the fox. And the bee felt small. The fox remembered old hunts. And the birds remembered old escapes from the fox. And the bee remembered old flowers. The fox tested again. And the birds tested sharper than the fox. and the bee tested air. The fox's shadow lengthened, and the bird's shadows lengthened over the fox. And the bee's shadow flickered. The fox lifted head, and the birds lifted wings above the fox. And the bee lifted hum. The fox crouched once more, and the birds rose once more from the fox. And the bee rose too. The fox howled in defeat, and the birds cried victory over the fox. And the bee hummed softly. The fox walked away, and the birds still watched the fox, and the bee still followed. The fox knew the birds had won, and the birds knew they had outsmarted the fox. And the bee knew balance. The fox returned to forest, and the birds returned to nest safe from the fox. And the bee returned to hive. The fox dreamed of the birds, and the birds dreamed of the fox. And the bee dreamed too. The fox woke again, and the birds woke again to see the fox. And the bee woke too. The fox remembered the birds, and the birds remembered the fox. And the bee remembered balance. The fox and the birds will meet again, and the fox and the birds will test again. And the bee will watch again. The fox returned at dawn, and the birds were already awake above the fox. And the bee trembled in the morning chill. The fox slunk through dew, and the birds fluttered wings wet above the fox. And the bee brushed droplets away. The fox lifted nose to scent, and the birds lifted eyes to guard the fox. And the bee lifted flight again. The fox paused under trees, and the birds perched above the fox. And the bee hid in blossoms. The fox's stomach growled, and the birds' hearts beat faster at the fox. And the bee buzzed nervously. The fox leapt at shadows, and the birds shrieked at the fox. And the bee spun in circles. The fox felt frustration rise, and the birds felt defiance against the fox. And the bee felt trapped between. The fox prowled deeper, and the birds flew higher from the fox. And the bee chased sunlight. The fox's eyes gleamed gold, and the bird's feathers gleamed brighter than the fox. And the bee gleamed faintly. The fox planned in silence, and the birds planned with sharp calls to outwit the fox. And the bee planned only survival. The fox sprang suddenly, and the birds sprang faster than the fox. And the bee darted away. The fox's teeth snapped air, and the bird's wings snapped louder than the fox. And the bee snapped branches in rush. The fox crouched in anger, and the birds circled mocking the fox. And the bee circled nervously. The fox stared upward, and the birds stared downward at the fox. And the bee stared from a flower. The fox bared fangs, and the birds spread wings wider than the fox. And the bee spread tiny legs. The fox's roar echoed, and the bird's cries echoed louder than the fox. And the bee echoed faint hum. The fox moved in shadow, and the birds moved in light away from the fox. And the bee moved between. The fox waited for dusk, and the birds waited for safety beyond the fox. And the bee waited in silence. The fox thought of tomorrow, and the birds thought of tomorrow against the fox. And the bee thought of tomorrow's nectar. The fox and the birds remained eternal rivals, and the fox and the birds would always face each other, and the bee would always witness.